prize for most screenwriting credits. We'd have one of those, unfortunately, he can't be here with us tonight moments. That's because the winner, with over 1,000, is William Shakespeare. But how can a man who died long before the invention of cinema have racked up so many credits? Simple, by creating the most moving, exciting, and enduring stories ever written. Shakespeare showed us what it means to be human. We've all been lovesick or heartbroken, like Romeo and Juliet, or felt Macbeth's burn of greed and ambition. Who hasn't experienced jealousy like Othello? No wonder artists around the globe are still eager to adapt Will's works.
As we have seen in Onkara, Moon and Hair. He's also the first playwright in school and college theatre in 2017, as he was in 1917. Perhaps it is worthwhile to understand why. And we have two gentlemen here to help us on this journey. We have Mr. Ravi, a distinguished and highly decorated police officer, and a sign, if you use the steps, I think that's sir. And a sign of the famous family. He served in the cabinet secretariat and retired as the principal secretary at home. Even though V.S. Ravi is a multifaceted author on science and literature, he is most passionate and an erudite scholar on everything Shakespeare. His columns and writings on the Bard in the Hindu, as well as his lectures on Shakespeare across many universities, have been much loved by people from all walks of life. Joining him is Keval Arora, a theatre practitioner, critic and commentator who teaches at the Department of English in Kirori College. He's also the staff advisor of the Players, which is the Kirori College Drama Society. So we have about 50 minutes, and we will have Ravi speak first, followed by Keval. So it's over to you, Ravi.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, when Mr. Madhavan requested me about 13 months ago to speak of the magic of Shakespeare, I welcomed it because I always felt that the Bard of Avon was a great magician with words and creation of characters, spinning stories and yarns. But somewhere along, they changed it to, is Shakespeare relevant? Now, I was not taken aback or anything, but this transformation slightly made me do some adjustment, because I was tempted to ask, how can there be a time when Shakespeare is not relevant at all? Now, great as the achievements of science and technology have been, Shakespeare has not lost. Shakespeare, Kalidasa, Kambar, Homer, Dante, Voltaire, they have all not lost their hold on what is perennial in man. Of course, all of you would be tempted to say, this is the age of science and technology. Vast advances have been made in every branch of science. Biology, neurophysiology, astrophysics, chemistry, computers, etc. This is the age where we see visible proof of science helping us through technology. Medical diagnosis, medical treatment has improved because of medical technology. Similarly, we are able to move more faster from one place to another by jets. Therefore, Shakespeare and others aren't they irrelevant now, because they lived at a time when all this was not there. They were probably, men had a lot of leisure and they could afford to, or probably they needed some kind of entertainment, and this was the entertainment. But we in this age, busy as we are, we don't need this kind of entertainment. So why should we read? Now the answer to that is, poetry, art, music, these are all always relevant, because man is basically a biological creature. As Shakespeare himself said in Hamlet, what a piece of work is man, how in apprehension like a god, how in action like an angel, how this beauty of the world, this paragon of animals. Shakespeare recognized that man, for all his glory and his achievement, is basically an animal, and therefore his own emotions, like the basic emotions like revenge, gratitude, hatred, greed, ambition, these will always be of interest to him. These issues have agitated Shakespeare. They will agitate people. They have been agitating people since the dawn of time, and so will they till the end of time, till man is there. Therefore, to say that a study of emotions is not relevant, it would not be correct. That is why Shakespeare explored in each of his great tragedies particularly some emotion. In Hamlet, he dwelt on revenge, the duty of Hamlet to his father, and then his indecision. Laurence Olivier, while introducing Hamlet, his movie, said only one sentence: "This is the story of a man who could not decide." And anybody who has read Hamlet knows that everywhere it is either to be or not to be. That is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune or by opposing anger. I mean, this goes on at every place in Hamlet, you can see that. Now, what, then why do we, then you may say, we as people are also preoccupied with these emotions. Why should we have to listen to a poet saying this, particularly Shakespeare? Then my answer to that is this, that poets do not say anything new. They have not discovered something new. But they say the oldest things in the newest kinds of ways. And there is a way in which a poet says, which makes us feel, oh my God, how I wish I had said it that way. This could be any pair of lovers saying that, saying why are the world conspiring against us? Why are we not allowed to marry? But that's what the normal people will say. But Umar Khayyam has said it in such a beautiful way that it will last till the end of time. Umar Khayyam says in another place, alas, that spring should vanish with the rose, that youth's sweet-scented manuscript should close, the nightingale that in the branches sang, whether and whence flown again, who knows. I just gave these two illustrations to show how poets only say what you and I think about, but they say it in such a way we make us say, how I wish I had said it in the manner that a poet has said it. Now comes the second part. Why are poets saying these things? Now there I take you to Shelley's word on a skylark. Shelley says about a skylark, he talked essentially about a skylark singing. Then he said, like a poet hidden in the light of thought, singing hymns unbidden, till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. Shelley was making this point that nobody has asked a skylark to sing. It is hidden. How can a bird be hidden in the light of thought? That itself gives a clue. But it sings hymns unbidden, till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. Similarly, Shakespeare wrote poetry because he felt like writing poetry. He didn't write to bore people or with the idea of selling tickets or anything. He wrote this poetry because I agitated about these major issues which I spoke to you about, and till the world was compelled to take notice of it, and he found that it was delighting audiences. Of course, he added props, ghosts, witches and all this in the Shakespearean theatre to make the audience Elizabethan audience getting interested in his plays. Now, I have told you why Shakespeare wrote all this. Now Shakespeare has become universal. In Burundi, people listen to him because they think he is associated with tribal revenge and all that. He is listened to by Italians because they relate to the Merchant of Venice. He is listened to in America because New York people think, Manhattan, I think that it symbolizes the diminishing of America's powers. The Australians react to Julius Caesar because it comment on federal politics. It could be about Turnbull versus Abbott and so on and so forth. Now without the time that is allotted to me is only 25 minutes unfortunately, 20 or 25 minutes, therefore I can't go deep into every aspect. I will straight away come to the method by which Shakespeare and Shakespeare alone is different from any other dramatist in any other part of the world, particularly in English literature, and as any other literature also, including Greek and Oriental literature. First of all, Shakespeare is unique in his delineation of characters. When most poets, in fact when all poets create characters, dramatists, they leave a certain impact on the character. They are the puppeteers, they are the puppeteers and the characters are the puppets. They are pulling them with unseen strings, and the puppets to a large extent do what the puppeteer tells them to do. Therefore, much as they want, they have no independence. You take for example a character like Loan in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman. There are not many ways in which he behaves. But in Shakespeare, Hamlet is released and Shakespeare has no control over him. And this Shakespeare repeats it time and again in every play, that once he creates the character acquires an individuality over which Shakespeare has no control. This is a remarkable ability. Now, if you ask me to give certain examples, I would give, for example, straight away I would start, what is the most conspicuous in Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Shakespeare has created them, and it was De Quincey who said that Macbeth is after all an ordinary murder story. But an ordinary murder story nobody would be interested in, except perhaps a policeman like me. But the common man would be interested because in the murderer's mind there is a hell as to the psychological forces which drive him to commit murder. In the case of Macbeth, it was his ambition to become a king, and he is sort of incited by his wife, and he kills the king. But in his mind there was a hell, and De Quincey says it is into this hell that we are asked to look. And in Macbeth, in order to gratify his own teeming faculty of creation, Shakespeare has created two murderers, and as usual in his hands, they are remarkably discriminated. This is the beauty of Shakespeare again. You close your eyes, you read the paragraph, you read the line, you know which line was uttered by Lady Macbeth, which line was uttered by Macbeth. This happens time and again, not only in heroes and heroines, but even handmaidens of Cleopatra like Charmian and Eros. Then like the plebeians in the last scene in Julius Caesar, like the noblemen Marulus and Flavius in the first scene in Julius Caesar. I can go on. Anywhere where there are two characters, you can say who is Charmian, who is Eros, who is Marulus and who is Flavius. Shakespeare, there are many instances where Shakespeare has done this. Therefore, I put it across to you that in the delineation of characters, Shakespeare has done something which is superhuman, which no other dramatist has been able to achieve. The second point which I would like to make is feminine beauty. If you take Greek drama and Oriental drama, poetry of Sanskrit, Telugu, Tamil, beauty is created, there is a certain set rules which the poet observes in order to paint a woman as beautiful. They have divided women into four categories: Padmini, Shankini, Hastini, Chitrani. The face is like a lotus, the hair is like clouds, the figure is like a willow, etc. With the result, what happened was, whenever they described any woman, these attributes and similes would come into play. Therefore, they lose their value at a certain stage. The handmaiden has the same attribute, the heroine has the same attribute. Like the great Kalidasa, India's greatest dramatist, says in one place about Saraswati, who is the goddess of learning. Chaturbhuje Chandra Kalavatam se Kuchonnate Kunchuma Raja Chone. Why should we talk about Saraswati's breasts? She is the goddess of learning. I can understand he talked about Damayanti or Parvati. So it's not necessary. Saraswati incidentally may be beautiful. If she is, he could say that. I am not saying a handmaiden is less beautiful than a princess. But when he is concentrating in a play on the beauty of the princess, he should leave the handmaidens alone. But this most dramatists don't do, whereas Shakespeare clearly did it. Then number two, Shakespeare's description of women's beauty is very subtle. It's not an organ recital. He doesn't take the head, the nose, the lips, the cheeks, the ears, the breast. This is not what Shakespeare does. He just gives a hint. It's something like impressionist art. He just gives one phrase or one sentence, and then you immediately conjure up the vision of a beautiful woman. In Twelfth Night, the only indication that we have about Viola being beautiful is when Viola herself tells the Duke about when the Duke is telling Viola how he is in love with Sylvia, and he says a woman can never love a man the way he loves Sylvia. But Viola, who is in love with the Duke, is trying to tell him women also love men in the same fashion, but she doesn't want to reveal her identity. So she says, my father had a daughter who loved a man. What was her history? The Duke asked. A blank, my lord. He never told her love, but pined in thought, letting sorrow like a worm in the bud feed on her damask cheek. That word damask is so beautifully chosen by Shakespeare to convey the beauty of Viola. Similarly, in Othello, he doesn't go into Desdemona's beauty that much, as when Othello says, I will not shed her blood, nor scar that whiter skin of hers than snow, smooth as monumental alabaster. That's enough. He has left the rest to our imagination. In another place, he talks about Jessica's golden fleece. Whether even Rosalind, of course, a few more phrases he has thrown in. Then Portia, every character, lady character of Shakespeare, when it comes to beauty, there is no organ recital at all. There is only a hint, a flourish, a touch, and then he lets you imagine how beautiful that woman can be. And of course, I'll be failing if I don't say the most beautiful quotation, the greatest tribute man ever paid to a woman was made by Shakespeare. He makes Enobarbus tell in Antony and Cleopatra about Cleopatra. Age cannot wither her, nor customs tell her infinite variety. Other women cloy the appetites they feed. She makes hungry where most she satisfies. I don't think that this needs any annotation or anything. He says she is so beautiful that age cannot wither her, nor customs tell her infinite variety. Other women cloy the appetite. He is attaching the significance of woman. Appetite they feed, but she makes hungry. She makes you want more and more of her. That's enough to tell us how great a beauty Cleopatra was. In another part of Antony and Cleopatra, Antony says, 5 more minutes. Okay. Antony merely says, 5 wrangling queen, whom everything becomes, to laugh, to chide, to weep. Meaning, whatever Cleopatra does, she is beautiful. I'll stop with feminine beauty with that. Shakespeare was a great scientist. He said, he made Brutus tell Portia, you are as dear to me as are the ruddy drops that visit my sad heart. He said this in 1599 when Julius Caesar was written. 1628, Harvey discovered the circulation of blood. How did Shakespeare know this? Another place, Shakespeare says, by medicine, in Cymbeline, there is a quotation, by medicine the disease may be cured, but in the end, the death will seize the doctor too. Then there are many other such instances. People may think Shakespeare did not know about what was going on in science. That is wrong. In Cymbeline, there is a scene, Jupiter himself comes, and there is a scene where witches go around a fire. This is supposed to represent the moons, recently discovered moons of Jupiter by Galileo. Then a brief word about his vocabulary. It's the greatest vocabulary on the face of the earth. He packed his place with 937,000 words, of which 27,000 were base words. He has coined 1,700 words. Some people even say 2,500. And then the beauty about his vocabulary is, modern German has got only 186,000 words. That means in 16th century, Shakespeare had 5 times the vocabulary of modern German. He had 50 figures of speech. Some of the figures of speech are so obscure, it's beyond the imagination of even a Milton or a Wordsworth. Grammarians are racking their heads even now. They have identified 50. Then his phrases have been taken for titles for books by great novelists. They have become household phrases. There is the rub, the milk of human kindness, where eagles there, the rose by any other name. All these have become, the apparel of proclaims the man. These have all become household words. So how can we say Shakespeare is irrelevant when every day in and day out in some house or the other, we are talking Shakespeare, we are exchanging words about Shakespeare. And Dixon, one of the great Shakespearean critics says, You go to Tokyo and you say to be or not to be in the Ginza, and they will say, why are you quoting Hamlet? So that is the most technologically advanced society is Japan. Then these passages are very musical. I wish I could quote them, but I will only say one passage if Rini permits. There is one famous passage where Macbeth is full of blood on his hand and he is feeling guilty. Now this gives the entire musical effect of Shakespeare. He says, will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. The beauty of this passage is, incarnadine was a Latin word. It was originally a 16th century adjective to denote pink or light red, but Shakespeare used it as a verb. Why I am trying to say this is, Shakespeare was a wordsmith. He could do anything he wanted with words. He could add suffixes, he could remove prefixes, he could turn them around, and still, when Shakespeare has said it, it becomes part of modern English. Though of course, incarnadine is not now used. Similarly, he used most unkind, he used double comparison. They have not been accepted in modern English. Rini, one last sentence?
Yes.
Okay, only one more. My tribute to Shakespeare is, all that I have said about, I wish I could have said more. I regard Shakespeare as an intellectual ocean whose waves touched all the shores of thought, within which were found all the tides and waves of destiny and will, over which blew the storms of ambition, fate and revenge, upon which fell the gloom and darkness of death and despair, and the sunlight of love and content. An intellectual ocean towards which all the great rivers ran, and from which all the isles and continents of thought now, even today, receive their dew and rain, and they will continue to do so. Thank you.
I do more than just teach Shakespeare. I engage with theatre, and it's from that perspective that I wish to say, I want to say a few words about why I too think he is relevant, but not quite in the shape in which Shakespeare has been ordinarily and commonly perceived or has been received by us. I'm not going to get into the question of, relevance is a dirty word when we think about culture. Obviously for practitioners who make a living out of it, it has to be relevant. But for many people, I think culture is the kind of thing you do in your spare time. It's what you do when you stop attending to the more urgent necessities of the day. And in that sense, this question mark of relevance hangs over every single thing, whether we are talking about music, literature, painting, and Shakespeare too. Specifically with regard to Shakespeare, therefore, when I'm thinking about the relevance of Shakespeare, I'm putting it into a subset, which is that let's assume theatre is relevant. And then when we are talking about theatre being relevant or telling, I don't like using the word theatre because most of us see films today rather than watch theatre. So I'd much rather think of it in terms of performed narratives, whether on television, whether on cinema screens, or for the few of us who still can leg it over to a theatre auditorium in the theatre. Why Shakespeare? That for me is the question. Why not, for instance, Molière? Why not, for instance, the name mentioned, Kalidas? What is it that makes for the enduring legacy, the elasticity of this particular writer that sees him become a kind of global phenomenon in a way in which I don't think any other dramatist has so seized the imagination or finance? Because it's so much easier if you're looking for a producer who is thinking of, will I not give you some money? Shakespeare continues to be somewhere along the line bankable in a way that other writers are not. Well, I think it's historic. We've got to recognize that in his own time, Shakespeare was neither regarded as the better dramatist or amongst the best dramatists by people who considered themselves the pundits of that age. There were other names that came up, and nor was he commercially the most successful. Again, there was another set of names that came up. Over a period of time, as opinion around Shakespeare crystallized into saying, well, here is a genius, different ages found different things to identify as the genius in Shakespeare. Language, as Mr. Ravi was speaking, has been one very, very important component of that. Storytelling, obviously another component. Characterization, very believable characters, and that really, I think, endures to this day. Many of us find his language, I'm thinking of my experience as a teacher, teaching Shakespeare to students who are hampered with modern English, let alone with 16th century English, struggling in the classroom to make sense of what's written on the page. And then the moment a film version of the same play is shown, it's the same student who says, "Ye to samajh mein aa raha hai. जो किताब में छापा गया है उसे समझने में दिक्कत हो रही है." And there obviously it's a momentum that comes with storytelling. It's a momentum which comes with believability of human, not emotion. I don't think emotion excites me as much, motivation. Why do people do what they do? What is it that makes this person switch and flip in this manner or that manner is what continuously, I think, provokes, stimulates, mystifies, etc. We have in the middle of all this, of course, in India especially, and I think when you're talking about India, I don't mean India itself, I'm talking about colonial outposts. We have over here, of course, the British Empire. I think it would be very wrong to not credit the British Empire for this continuing fascination with theatre. Because post their decision to ensure that natives in far-flung outposts would be educated through English, and that a language education would be supplemented by a literature education, Shakespeare willy-nilly came into the classroom. An interesting statistic is that Shakespeare came to be taught in India earlier than Shakespeare came to be taught in Britain. In Britain, Shakespeare was introduced into polytechnic universities around the same time it was introduced here. It's interesting, therefore, the idea of the rabble in Britain and the native in India as being the prime recipients of a kind of cultural brainwashing. I think that's how we have to see it. What's interesting with Shakespeare is that in the post-colonial stage, Shakespeare has still survived. There's been a certain kind of purging that has happened. I know, for example, मुझसे जब कभी पूछा जाता है, तो क्या अभी भी Shakespeare पढ़ाया जाता है? Shakespeare becomes therefore a kind of normative phrase for the foreign literature that you're still teaching. It also partly, for instance, accounts for this terrible schizophrenia that's there in most universities. At the university where I teach literature, I teach culture. That, however, is not my formal designation. I am a professor of English. Now, the fact that culture departments still tend to be identified by language, Department of English, rather than Department of Literature, I think is a potent reminder of where and how where the story began and how it still continues to ossify. Specifically, coming back to the question of Shakespeare and how is it that this particular writer's output has continued to occupy the imagination, I would imagine that the primary reason for that is the fact that he exists today as a global template. I'm not sure whether he became part of the global template by reasons of virtue. As I said, the empire has had a lot to do with it. But once having been kind of piggybacked or leapfrogged into that space, there is just so much Shakespeare known all over the world. And in a space, in cultures, as a mythological imagination is shrinking and it becomes more a part of a historical memory than a part of a lived secular space, it's interesting to see how very often Shakespeare's narratives have taken over or have at least crept into that space. It's very rare now to find somebody who does not have a rough idea of, yeah, okay, Macbeth, is it that play about, etc., etc.? You've not read Macbeth. You've possibly not seen a performance of Macbeth, but you'll have a rough idea what Macbeth is like. And if you're, of course, an audience that consumes cinema, that consumes theatre, then your familiarity with that is going to be much, much more. Shakespeare, therefore, for me, becomes a global template, becomes a shared mythology, and in theatre, he's lapped up absolutely. Of course, what helps us a lot is a kind of shift that's happening in theatre practices. Local theatre, let's just take a look, for example, at what's happening in Delhi. Theatre done by Delhi theatre groups for Delhi audiences is shrinking. Whereas theatre that is done by a Delhi group that will perform in Bombay today and then maybe performing somewhere else tomorrow and somewhere else day after, theatre as an exportable cultural commodity is increasing, and this has really got to do with the advent of the theatre festival. We see this happening in cinema. So much of small indie cinema today is actually first distributed by being sent to a film festival abroad. I think of The Ship of Theseus. I don't know if I would have ever heard of The Ship of Theseus if feedback hadn't come from how it had performed at Vancouver, how it had performed at this festival, that festival, and then it gets released in the local market. Now, if you're looking to do an international theatre, if you're looking to go and do a play that can sell to audiences outside of your country, then really what you're looking at is a text that has a certain quality of international access. And that's where the idea of a global template, that's where the idea of a shared mythology comes in. It's interesting today that Shakespeare as a playwright is no longer alive. I think today when you and I say Shakespeare, what we mean is the story that Shakespeare wrote. We are not saying Shakespeare as the man who wrote the story. So I think of Olivier Shakespeare, I think of Kurosawa Shakespeare, I'll think of Royston Abel Shakespeare, I'll think of Rajat Kapoor's Shakespeare. I'm not going to say Shakespeare's Shakespeare. Now to that extent, directors cut their teeth on Shakespeare. It becomes a place where you can say, oh, did you see his Macbeth? Go and see her Macbeth. Go and see that director's Macbeth. It becomes a place where jockeying for finance becomes possible. It becomes easier because there are literally products of the same kind that can be put on the table and can be compared, etc. So I think that in terms of how the market has allowed Shakespeare to survive, this is the one take I had on it. I enjoy Shakespeare. And I'm not saying I enjoy Shakespeare because I'm professionally compelled to do so. I enjoy Shakespeare. I've been teaching him for donkey's years and I still feel like a donkey when I teach him because he has a capacity to suddenly spring a surprise. I can look at the text which I've taught for the last 5 years and this time when I'm reading it, I'll say, I hadn't noticed this earlier. That capacity, that kind of layering of depth that you find in Shakespeare for me continues to, I'd imagine, is one reason why he seems inexhaustible. The line that Mr. Ravi quoted, Enobaba's speaking of Cleopatra, age cannot wither nor custom stale, etc., etc. I almost think like that's a swan song he wrote for himself. That's not Cleopatra's beauty being spoken of, that's Shakespeare's telling himself, patting himself on the back, saying, my theatre is going to survive. And that's a joke, I don't mean that. What's my last final comment on Shakespeare? What I'm proud to say I'm not on Twitter. I think 140 letters is suffocating. But every now and then a newspaper person comes along and says, I want a soundbite. And I remember this one particularly persistent character who hounded me for about 2 weeks saying, can you define theatre in 3 or 5 words? 3 or 5 words. And I said, you know, तुम इतने कंजूस क्यों हो यार? 3-5 शब्द में कैसे काम चलेगा? But I then finally had to take it on as a challenge. And I came up with a phrase which at least at that time I think it was like, I saved my neck because he looked satisfied and walked away. But I've over a period of time come to believe in it myself. Now that's maybe a sad admission. Playing with otherness is, I told him, I think what actually for me is theatre about, which is it allows you to step outside and look at other spaces, other worlds, etc. Now to me, Shakespeare is really the master craftsman when it comes with playing with otherness. This may seem a fancier way of saying what Mr. Ravi just said, which is about characterization. But I think not characterization as if, why I think it's not the same is because I don't mean characterization as a gallery of characters, where you can be impressed by, oh look, he's got a murderer, look, he's got a cutthroat, look, he's got a beautiful woman. No, I don't think that kind of gallery interests me. It's his ability to get into the skin of people who are clearly not close to his heart. Disagreeable people in his stories become absolutely believable, yes, but also capable of inciting from you, provoking from you a certain empathy. It's as if everybody has a right to live, and how much more democratic than can that get? The villains in Shakespeare seduce you absolutely. They're not villainous. And fair enough, because the villain doesn't see himself as a villain. It's some abstract moral judgment that makes us think of them as villains. But Iago, I think of in Othello. Edmund, I think of him in Lear. These are people who believe absolutely in the validity of what they are doing. And the phrase that Mr. Ravi used, that Shakespeare releases them. He lets them talk, he lets them breathe. He of course said that he doesn't control them, they go out of control. No, I don't quite believe that, because at the end of the day, the story still holds together, it hinges together. But to allow people their say, to not shut them down, to not tell them, hang on, I'm going to put the words in your mouth, and at the same time to so inflect the narrative that the purpose or the point of the story, the things that Shakespeare wants to say are not lost. I think that calls for a very skillful walking of the tightrope, which to my mind is actually the skill of the dramatist. Because finally when you're seeing the play, or even when you're reading it, you have only the actions and the words of the characters given to you. The playwright's voice is never available. So that question, what does the playwright think? What does Shakespeare think? Well, you're not going to get any quotable quote there, because you can only get to know what Hamlet said and what somebody else, what Ophelia said in response. That absenting of the playwright is a critical feature of how all dramatic communication works, and I think Shakespeare does it better than most. Coming back to the first part, why Bharat needs a bard. I mean, I feel like saying need one say more. Because the kind of fractious times in which we live, if only we have learned to practice seeing and listening, the way Shakespeare worked it out in terms of in relation to his characters, which is the ability to see the world through somebody else's eyes, the ability to stand in somebody else's shoes, maybe we'd be a happier place and we'd be smiling a bit more nowadays. Thank you. We've had a signal change of how we talk about literature in the classroom today. I find that maybe about 15 or 20 years ago, there was a kind of impatience, especially with the women in Shakespeare's plays, because fair enough, those women just seemed to be terribly hidebound and hidebound in terms of convention, and also perhaps not strong enough in terms of taking responsibility for themselves. But when you get a different demographic in the classroom, suddenly the difficulty of the spaces in which these women live has come alive in a very different way, because perhaps, I don't know, I'm just speculating, this is the kind of pop psychology that teachers do when they're across the table on the other side of the room. I'm just beginning to wonder that perhaps because of this new demographic that's entered into the classroom, Shakespeare's stories, depressingly, one has to admit it's a depressing fact, his stories seem contemporary. That the woman who cannot move a muscle without her father's approval is not a museum artifact from the 16th century, but very much alive and kicking in the 21st in India. So yes, to that extent, I would say that student responses have, to me, in a sense, broadened into a different understanding, but I don't think, I'm here talking about different demographics in the classroom. I find in my head, perhaps I'm so much a creature trained by the Western imagination, in the modes of the Western imagination, that for me, the model of theater is obviously contemporary, but my contemporary traces itself backwards to maybe an Aristotelian theory rather than a Bharat Muni. The kind of harmonization that you find within the Natya Shastra, interesting, because after all, the origins of theater, as the Natya Shastra reveals to us, does not come out of harmony. It comes out of recognizing a disharmony in the universe, and theater is what will bring communities or different sections together. Now, theater is, in other words, given a certain kind of, let's say, responsibility of not just social but cosmic engineering, which you don't find in Aristotle. Aristotle acknowledges the fact that theater works through conflict, so that the protagonist and then you have the antagonist. Now, today, for example, when we use the word dramatic, what do we mean by the word dramatic when we're not talking in terms of culture? You know, there was a rather dramatic meeting that happened with our boss today. Automatically, what you mean is conflictual. And that's Western. That's a Western concept of theater. So I think somewhere along the line, Kalidas can be enjoyed for, let's say, a felicity of expression, for poetry, for musicality, but for stories that in a sense grab you in gritty manners, in manners which are gritty. Let's say he doesn't stoke my fire, okay? So I'm not sure I can respond to the question on Kalidas. I think people who enjoy their Kalidas more than I have would be better placed to respond to that. Mohan Rakesh, I find it interesting that you throw Kalidas and Rakesh into the same pot. Oh, ye kahan se aaya? Yeah. Mohan Rakesh, of course. Sorry? Mohan Rakesh, of course. Well, of course. But I think that's where I was trying to, when I talked to you about, let's say, the business of finance, the seduction of the festival, will Mohan Rakesh travel outside? Mohan Rakesh continues, at least the one major Mohan Rakesh, which is Adhe Adhure. Again, as I said, the frightening things about these stories is that they don't seem to have dated. And the fact that today we can still be thinking of a Savitri whose sexuality, I mean, one can just remember our minister saying that women need to be locked up. I mean, curfew in the hostels are important because otherwise they'll have hormonal outbreaks. We've got Mohan Rakesh thinking about Savitri as a woman with terribly hormonal outbreaks. So what's changed between that and now? As long as we don't evolve, we don't have to ask the question whether literature is relevant. We have to ask ourselves, are we evolving?
You're not audible, so you need to use...
No. Okay, so the point about, being ruled by the British and obviously Shakespeare, that's it. That I completely concede. But the fact of the matter being that Mohan Rakesh, beyond Adhe Adhure, even Ashar Ka Ek Din, for example, is one of the most beautiful treatises I've ever seen about what being Indian and what longing really is. So coming back to a lot of characters, heroines in Shakespeare, longing is one of the biggest challenges they have. That's all I meant.
I use the word elasticity when referring to Shakespeare. There's something very curious about what happens with Shakespeare. It's not just that when I say that this is Olivia's Hamlet and that so-and-so's Macbeth, etc., I'm still thinking of, let's say, how Olivia approaches Hamlet as a consolidated text, the one that Shakespeare wrote. But look at the play that came from Tajikistan right now and was performed at the Bharat Rang Mahotsav. It was an adaptation that picked up elements from Hamlet, elements from Lear, called it Fool's Court, and presented. Now, Shakespeare, interestingly, allows for this kind of, if you don't like it, you'll call it semiotic vandalism. But when it clicks, boy, does it click. And I think there's something to do, it's got something to do with the kind of, one step into modernity. So the Greek tragedy is not quite as modern as the Shakespearean tragedy is, and at the same time, a performing style which does not have a recognizable signature. And I think that makes a considerable difference.
Except Antigone, which still stands out as being one of the most powerful things ever a Greek guy could have written. Not true.
You have to, if you have to perform it today, you'd have to adapt it in a way that Sophocles had not thought of Antigone. And yes, Brecht has done Antigone, Kierkegaard has touched upon Antigone. That's one play that has often been adapted. Yeah, Anhui has done it. But all those adaptations have actually involved having to leave Sophocles aside. Whereas it's interesting that adaptations of Shakespeare do not depart from Shakespeare.
No.
At the same time, they negotiate Shakespeare. So that there are formal adaptations, and etc., etc. This can get too long. Chekhov is the question that came up. It's because English has kind of facilitated the global passage of Shakespeare. Of course. The Chekhov who's known today is known through his English. So that if it wasn't for English, I don't think you would even be asking the question about Chekhov. And wondering why Chekhov is not quite in the same league, or not placed in the same league as Shakespeare is. So too with Brecht. I would imagine he's the greatest 20th century playwright, and yet it's not until his Berliner Ensemble performs in German, but tickling people's interest in London, that actually Brecht enters into the English-speaking academy, both Anglo and American.
I have one question for Mr. Ravi. I have a small question for you. You said even Shakespeare was even familiar in some ways with science, or there was a relevance that you mentioned about science and Shakespeare. Is it because of some intuition that he had, extraordinary intuition? Do you think Shakespeare had extraordinary intuition that...
I suppose he had, because I didn't have time at that I went very fast. There are a few more indications to show that Shakespeare was very scientific in outlook. That would have been a better way of putting it. I would have liked to say that in detail. For example, I don't mean to offend anybody if there are believers here, but he lived at the same time as Kepler. Kepler was a man who discovered the laws of planetary motion.
Okay.
He ought to have known better than to believe in astrology, which is a pseudoscience. Now, Kepler was a practicing astrologist, and he got horoscopes to his house, and he was predicting people's futures. Here was Kepler, and there was Shakespeare. Now, what was Shakespeare thinking about astrology? He said, "Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs to find ourselves dishonorable graves. Men at some times are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, lies in ourselves, not in our star."
Thank you.
Now, the same thing he does in King Lear, another quotation which thought this is the excellent foppery of the world. Now, that is astrology. Now, he says about death, of all the things that seem so strange to me, is that men fear death, a necessary end shall come when it shall come. He says, death is as natural as life. Why should people be afraid of it? Now you may say, what is profound about this? I'll tell you what is profound about it. Till very recently, biologists didn't know that death is absolutely essential for the survival of a species. Just as birth is essential, unless the species, slowly the older generation is removed, nature cannot make room for the new generation to come in. That is this absolute truth, that death is a certainty. Man can only prolong longevity. The oldest man now living is only 115. It is agreed among scientists that however much you control all the diseases, however much you control all the maladies, including cancer and all, still there is cellular death which overtakes you and cannot push you beyond 120. Right. Now this is what Caesar said to Calpurnia, but he said it in a different way. Now there are many such, then he said to Hamlet, tells Ophelia, doubt thou the stars are fire, doubt truth to be a liar, doubt the sun doth move, but never doubt I love. Now you may say, was he questioning the heliocentric hypothesis that the sun did not move and that the earth moved? Now many Shakespearean scholars might think that. I am no great scholar, I mean especially in front of somebody like him. But to me, I would only say, in a sense Shakespeare seems to have been right, because we now know the sun is a very small, insignificant star in a very insignificant galaxy, in a very insignificant Milky Way, called the Milky Way. Now therefore, and stars do move. They are not stationary. The sun is not where we think it is. It had moved away. Therefore, in that sense, was it a premonition? Did Shakespeare know? Nobody can say. But he seemed to have said that. I would take it that Shakespeare knew what he was talking about.
Right.
I've given you a few instances that